Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the inaugural address of our 101st President, Jane Entwistle. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the institution, whether you are joining us live here in the auditorium this evening or online. We know that we have over 500 people registered to join the event from around the world. It is super to have you with us. Here in London at HQ, COVID restrictions mean that we are again limited with the number of people that we have in the auditorium, but I'm delighted to welcome Jane, her family and guests and friends, and representatives from the world of the institution, student members, past presidents, representatives of the board, and members of our various committees and the regional groups especially. It is good to have so many of you here in these continuing trying circumstances. The evening will run unscheduled, unchaired. It'll follow automatically. And my first duty is to welcome our new Senior Vice President, Matt Byatt, who will take us through the next step of this evening's event. Thank you very much.
Good evening. Before we introduce our 101st President and ask her to the stage, I thought this would be an ideal opportunity to reflect on our 100th President. Last night, the board celebrated Don McQuillan's presidency at a board dinner and acknowledged the tremendous role that he has played during an extended 2-year term of office. This morning, Don was presented with his inscribed Past President's badge. On behalf of the board, I would like to say that we're all thankful for Don's calm and considered leadership during this most unusual period, and for the resilience shown during a presidency that was far from what was expected 2 years ago when Don stood here and delivered his 2020 inaugural address. Notwithstanding the restrictions imposed upon Don's tenure by, we'll call it one thing and another, he has steered the institution admirably and maintained focus on the climate emergency, competence, and the creation of a truly global institution. Thank you, Don. Now, it gives me great pleasure to invite to the stage our 101st President of the Institution of Structural Engineers, Jane Entwistle, to give her inaugural address.
Thank you, Matt, and welcome everybody. Thank you for coming along, and thank you to everybody who's listening at home or in offices, wherever you are, over your tea or your breakfast, depending on what part of the world you happen to be in. Now, if anybody had actually told me 50 years ago that I'd be taking up this presidential role, I'd probably actually said, okay, great. Because at that age, youngsters take most things in their stride. If anyone had said 25 years ago, I'd have said, no way. I just pay my subs, and the qualification is all I need from the institution. 10 years ago, I'd have said, nah, it's not for me. Yet, here I am. Still a bit of a surprise to me, but extremely honoured to be taking on this role of representing our institution and its members over the coming year, which hopefully won't turn into 2 years as Don did. Those of you who already know me will be aware that my key area of work is with historic buildings. You may also know that there's been a continuous theme in my involvement with the institution, which has been considering the effect that change is made here at the centre of the organisation, what effect they might have out in the regions. It will therefore be no surprise to you that the theme of my presidential year would be knowledge, skills, history, a foundation for a climate positive future. So you might wonder who I am. I mean, I think I do at times. But I was brought up in a small village in Wiltshire, which is in the south of England, where my father was the local doctor. In terms of education, I moved with my cohort from the village primary school to a middle school, and then on to Gillingham Comprehensive, where I did my O-levels. And then I went on to Salisbury to South Wilts Grammar School for the A-levels. And at that stage, I had no idea of what career I wanted to follow, other than knowing it was going to be science-based. At 13, I thought I wanted to be a meteorologist. So I avidly collected weather data. And I kept doing that for a few years, but not actually long enough to appreciate the effects of our changing climate. And then came the time at which I needed to think about what course I was going to do, what degree course I was going to do. And the school wasn't actually especially helpful in giving me any advice. Instead, Ian, who was a family friend and just happened to be a careers advisor, met with me one Saturday morning, and we spent time just talking, and he listened about areas of my studies that I was either good at or enjoyed. And he was actually the one who came up with the idea of engineering. It sounded quite good to me. So I thought, yeah, that's fine. So I told my parents, and then later I told my school. I said, this is my chosen career. And I've actually never regretted a decision that was made that quickly. I do often think, though, about youngsters who don't have that good fortune of having a friend who can help them recognise their potential and help them sort out their path forwards. In that single morning, Ian had set the path for my future, and he'd actually put me onto a life journey. So, A-levels. They weren't a great success. And through the clearing process, I ended up at Manchester University reading civil engineering. And I'll actually be eternally grateful to Dr. Jim Dickey, who was the admissions tutor back at that time, who saw some potential in me. And he offered me that chance. Jim and I have remained friends since then, and he's encouraged me through every stage of my career. Unfortunately, he couldn't make it this evening, but Jim, I know you're listening in, so thank you so much for that help all through my career. My first job was with Arup in Manchester. There were many outstanding and memorable characters there who encouraged me, but the one who probably had the most influence was Colin Wood. He's sadly no longer with us. But he combined teaching and mentoring with encouraging and just a natural caring attitude. He had a really down-to-earth style and a thorough understanding of engineering principles, and this appealed to me. It was actually Colin who was responsible for introducing me to the institution of structural engineers. As a graduate, he encouraged me to attend the Lancashire and Cheshire Hot Pot Supper. That's our inaugural meeting of the year. It was attended that year, as was normal at that stage, by both the President and the Chief Executive. I was really impressed by what I heard, and at that stage I thought that I wanted to have an active part in this organisation. It did actually take another 15 years before that happened, but hey. You may notice there's a bit of a theme emerging of people who encouraged me along the way. The vast majority of people, for them to succeed in any walk of life, is positive encouragement. And when I look back at the presidential address given by Sarah Buck in 2007, her theme was to attract, support, and enthuse. And these three aspects were clearly provided by Ian, Jim, and Colin in my early formative years. I was with Arup for just over 6 years until the 1991 recession. And during that time, I developed a strong grounding in both concrete and steelwork design. But it was also then that my interest in historic buildings began to really take some shape. My next job was with Byram Clark Roberts, which is multidisciplinary SME in Manchester. And in that setting, I learned to work closely with in-house architects and building surveyors, and the principles of working collaboratively as a team started to take root. Much of my work at that stage was on church projects and on the historic mill buildings in and around Manchester and Lancashire. Both of these areas of work required a good understanding of old, but not necessarily listed buildings. In order to repair or alter them, it's first essential to understand how they work. Also, to be able to determine which defects are inherent due to their design and which are due to a lack of maintenance or inappropriate alterations that have been made in the past. At BCR, we also undertook a large amount of domestic insurance work, mostly relating to subsidence. And during my time with that company, we saw 2 unusually dry summers, which was an indicator, certainly looking back, that our climate was changing at an increased rate. This was actually another period of learning, not just the technical aspects of the work, but also the social aspects of our role as engineers, and in particular how to manage the budget of any size of project, from a tiny domestic budget up to a multi-million-pound project. For the last nearly 19 years, I've been working with Thomasons in Manchester, and it's been in this role that I further developed my conservation work, and I'm proud to have achieved accreditation as a conservation engineer through CARE. And as such, I can consider myself as a custodian of our cultural heritage. And I can also see myself as being an advocate for historic buildings on which I have the good fortune to work. Whilst CARE focuses primarily on historic buildings and listed buildings, I've actually always been of the opinion that wherever possible, old buildings should be treated with the same care and consideration, whether they're listed or not. Albeit there are times when the best decision for a building may not concur fully with conservation principles, but also there are times when change is appropriate in order to develop or protect a building for the future. With historic buildings, the overarching principles are that modern interventions should be subservient to the listed structure and, wherever possible, reversible. To give an indication of the scope of my work, I've included in the written version of this address 2 examples of projects I've worked on in the last few years. The first one was here at Norton Priory Museum in Runcorn in the northwest of England. Here we worked on the site of a scheduled monument to link the historic Grade 1 listed part with the rather ugly 1980s building that you see on the right. The archaeological excavations, and we had to have archaeological excavations for the new foundations, they had exposed a medieval wall, and we were allowed to build over it, but we couldn't put any weight onto it. As a result, we suspended the glazed facade from a veer and deal truss, which was supported between the new lift shaft, which you see on the right, and the historic structure on the left. The second example is a timber-framed Tudor part of Wythenshawe Hall, again in the northwest of England. This had suffered from an arson attack. We only removed the worst of the fire-damaged timbers and reconstructed the frame, rebuilding the infill brickwork faithfully to its pre-fire arrangement. They'd actually taken the bricks out and numbered them so they could put them back again. So for many years, it's been fairly niche and, to be honest, a bit unfashionable to work with old buildings. But that's changed. And in the time that I've been thinking about this address, for perhaps the first time in my life, I've actually found myself in a position of leading rather than sort of following. And this is as the realization that it's better to reuse buildings for a good and sustainable future. The focus of what I'm saying today has actually changed subtly from how I would have presented my thoughts a year ago, had Don not taken on a second year. And that in itself is actually really encouraging, because it shows how much the awareness is growing within, and the momentum as well within our industry to take action to help reduce the climate emergency in which we now find ourselves. As I drafted this address, and this just shows you how long this process takes, but as I was drafting it, we were hearing of the worst wildfires in Cyprus that had occurred over recent decades. There was devastating flooding in Germany, and there were mudslides in Japan. And that's not to mention the unusually cold temperatures in eastern Australia and the record high temperatures also at that same time being experienced in Western Canada. And those were temperatures that were approaching the limits of what a human body can withstand. Now, I know that there are still many folk who consider that it's a politicised viewpoint. But when we consider the impact of construction, and in particular, the impact of new construction on the environment, on an environment that's changing so quickly, we surely have to take action to transform society by transforming our actions for the public good and for the good of our planet. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to give a lecture about our current climate emergency. There are many people who are far, far better equipped than me to do that. But we do have to accept that we have wicked problems to face up to. Now, for those of you who aren't up on the jargon, and I wasn't until quite recently, a wicked problem is a problem that's difficult, if not impossible, to resolve. And that's due to its nature being contradictory and incomplete. Its parameters change so that they're often difficult to recognise. In addition, it's difficult to define, it's socially complex, is rarely the responsibility of a single stakeholder, and its solutions will involve changing of behaviours. So in order to tackle wicked problems, we need to be both prophets to understand the problems and wizards to find ways of solving them. We spent generations believing that our methods are always better and more advanced than those of our predecessors. Now, I don't dispute that this may often be the case, but I argue that we must not assume this to be true. New is not always the best. I cite an example shared by one of my nephews. He's involved in the design of specialist optical equipment. He told me of a situation where it was decided that one of their products ought to be brought up to date and that it should embrace digital technology. They tried all sorts of methodologies and still couldn't get the product to be as good and reliable as their current version. They went back to the drawing board and they started from scratch. And what do they come up with? Something that was very close to their current product. What I particularly like about this story is that it tells an organisation that's prepared to look at the new and to fully investigate and test their options, but they're not scared to acknowledge that their current solution is still the most appropriate. Just before lockdown, I went to an excellent presentation where the speakers included Dr. Andy Knox and Professor Dame Sue Black. The event was about regeneration and reinvigoration of the seaside town of Morecambe in the northwest of England. The latter spoke of how we need to know our history, but not be restricted or limited by it. Dr. Knox pointed out that society is like a spider's web. It needs anchor points to allow it to grow. These words set me thinking about how we need to understand our heritage and to combine it with forward motion. Now, by our heritage, I don't just mean our societal heritage and history, but also our heritage as structural engineers. And we also need to know something of the history of why we design in the way that we do. We need to appreciate the details and the techniques, both current and historic, in order to understand what's good to keep and or copy. Now, some people keep their knowledge to themselves in order to maintain a commercial advantage. To me, that doesn't really make sense. Knowledge is far, far too exciting to keep it to yourself. And we can only improve our environment by sharing successes so that the wheel doesn't need to be repeatedly reinvented. Professor Dame Sue Black reminded us that research needs to be open and collaborative. We need to be generous with our knowledge and to realise that what we take for granted, because it's what we do, may actually be new information to others. By a similar token, we actually also need to share our failures and how to learn from them. Failure is an incredibly valuable tool to progress, provided that we learn from it. The most important thing is to fail forwards so that we and others can understand why that decision was a wrong path to take. In this, we need to be forgiving of mistakes made in the past. One example that I see on many buildings that I work is the inappropriate use of cementitious mortar instead of a lime mortar, particularly when repointing soft brickwork or stonework. The hard cement in the mortar makes it more durable and less porous than the brickwork around it. And this results in damage and erosion of the softer brick. This damage to the original fabric would not have been the intention of whoever specified the wrong type of pointing. But as conservation specialists, we've learned from their mistake, and we move forward with our repair technique and make sure that new materials introduced into historic buildings are subservient to the original fabric, such that they will fail and erode first. If we realise our mistake soon enough, we may be able to remove the unsympathetic and inappropriate mortar in order to preserve the original fabric of the building. But if the damage is too great, as seen on this slide, if it's too late, then it may be necessary to locally replace a brick. In a similar way, we need to make sure that that the changes we make to our planet are subservient, leaving only the lightest touch. We don't have the luxury of replacing part of our planet as we would a damaged brick in a wall. So instead, it's essential that we stop the damage that we're doing and, where appropriate, unpick some of the previous actions and habits. So how do we move forwards? In the past, we've been profligate with materials. We have, for good reasons at the time, used larger sections than required when we've been designing. This might have been to standardise member sizes. We've not considered the effect of our material choices on the environment, and this is a relatively new consideration to many of us. We've demolished buildings in order to build new and contemporary ones, to provide clients with the latest ideas and fashions. You'll hear me speak extensively about historic buildings, as that's my particular area of interest. But reuse of buildings is about much, much more than just historic structures. We need to be considering all buildings, whatever their age, as assets that should not be thrown away unless there is no other option. This is a Grade 2 star listed mansion which was ravaged by fire, just incidentally caused because there was no fire watch on a relatively minor piece of flat roof repair. The roofers went home Friday afternoon, the building caught fire, and as you can see, it was absolutely gutted. But because it was listed, Historic England prevented it from being demolished. We have worked on the reconstruction of the walls, and a new roof is currently being installed over this building. But the saving in the carbon footprint by repairing walls and providing new roof and floors, as opposed to demolition and rebuild, is enormous. Equally, there's a need or even a moral duty to engage with and inform clients to explore options based around the reuse of their buildings. Clients need to be informed about what is possible, whether their building can be retrofitted, for example, by insulation being added, to suit both their requirements and the current building and environmental requirements. Is their building suitable to be adapted, perhaps extended upwards? And if so, what are the implications on the existing structure and its foundations? What are the measures that we need to put in place to prevent disproportionate collapse? Or does their building only require restoration to bring it back into use? This is a museum in Newbury, in the south of England. It comprised a long, narrow, Grade 2 star listed granary building, linked to a Grade 1 listed cloth hall, and the link was here in a 1930s link building. The museum had been closed due to the lack of safe escape routes. So what we did was to take out that 1930s block from between the two historic buildings, and we constructed a new steel-framed link building, which provided adequate and properly designed vertical circulation and the additional escape routes that were required, thus allowing the museum to come back into use, with actually really quite minor restoration work being required to the two historic buildings. In my work, I frequently see timber frames that are being reused. It was normal to repurpose timber members from one structure to another. We need to start thinking in a similar way. But there again, why dismantle the building? Why not reuse it in its current location? At the same time, we can still embrace new ideas and techniques, but we must think about their potential to either prevent or accelerate climate change. New materials and techniques will always be exciting to us as engineers, but going forward, we need to look at them through the lens of whether they're good for our environment. Can they effectively reduce the carbon footprint of a building? Can they be used in conjunction with an existing structure to prolong the lifespan or enhance the capacity of a building? These are questions that we must ask ourselves as designers. The understanding of structural behaviour and structural materials has always been essential for structural engineers, and this will not change. A thorough grounding will always be required, and in some ways, it becomes more essential when we're considering the reuse or repurposing of existing buildings. However, it also needs to be acknowledged that for such work, it requires a subtly different set of skills from that used to design a new building. In order to be successful, it's necessary to understand the structures that are to be reused. It's essential to understand the materials, the effect that time and the environment has had on them, maybe pollution or the ingress of water, the levels of decay and deterioration of timber, steel and concrete, and what's the residual strength of the components that remain, and what's their suitability for inclusion and their adequacy, the adequacy of existing connections between them. This can sound daunting, and if not properly considered and understood, could be the death knell for many buildings. And there is a great danger that without suitable training, we could lose or damage our current building assets. Going forwards, we need to ensure that structural engineers are not only masters of new design, but also familiar and proficient in understanding the skills required to safely reuse structures. In addition, it will be essential that they understand how the existing building works. They may be fortunate and have records of the original construction, but was it, or was it what was intended as the original construction? They need to understand alterations that have already been made, and also, as I indicated, whether the building was actually built to those original drawings. One of the problems that I see going forwards is how to ensure that our engineers are competent in this ever-changing and increasingly challenging world. Often, in the older buildings, there are regional variations in the style and methods of construction. What Matt might see in East Anglia could be very different to what I might see in Lancashire. So I've been working on old and historic buildings for over 30 years, and I still regularly find details that are new and unexpected. We never stop learning. We are in a time of climate crisis, and we need to take action. But all the required knowledge is too much to learn in the classroom. So it's essential that we share our knowledge. We need to collaborate to ensure sufficient competence is developed to allow this important work to be undertaken in a proper and appropriate manner. The institution has a major role to play in this respect. We've been extremely fortunate to have Will Arnold taking a lead on climate action. With his enthusiasm and the hard work of the Climate Emergency Task Group, we've been able to develop a long way in a very short time. And our understanding of the severity of the situation that we need to deal with becomes increasingly clear to us. Last year, I chaired a task group which reviewed the appropriateness of our current exam. We reviewed the learning outcomes that need to be demonstrated by a competent engineer, particularly in relation to climate action. And we worked with the exams panel to understand how these learning outcomes could be incorporated into the exam process. This process of review occurs regularly, at least every 2 to 3 years, to ensure that our young professionals are ready at the cutting edge of our industry. Our members who are listening will be aware of the structural behaviour exam. I'm hoping that we'll soon see an equivalent qualification in relation to climate action. This will help provide our upcoming engineers with a thorough grounding in the knowledge that they need in this respect. So whilst that's a really good ambition for our future leaders, it still leaves a generation of our members, like me, and some people here, many people listening, who somehow need to get up to speed very quickly and at a time in their career when they're already incredibly busy. There's a wealth of excellent material. Just trying to work out which slide I'm on. It's a wealth of excellent material produced by our Climate Emergency Task Group, and this is essential reading. Over the time of the recent COVID pandemic, we've rapidly learned how effectively we can actually learn by attending virtual seminars. And we also realise just how important the local face-to-face meetings are for networking and sharing. I think that we need to develop some hubs where ideas and knowledge can be shared. The starting point for this would be our current regional groups. These already have a strong and essential track record for sharing of knowledge, and they'll remain as an essential backbone of the institution. The hubs that I envisage will be more fluid. They're likely to spawn smaller specialist groups, which may come and go as need demands. For example, in Lancashire and Cheshire, we have a wealth of former cotton mills. Many of them have already been redeveloped, but there's still a lot that are really ripe for development. So a local hub could offer advice in relation to this type of building and their peculiarities. For example, some guidance in relation to typical distortions that may be expected and whether or not these are of concern. There's plenty of work out there. If we share our knowledge, we can help other people also get started. Now I'm going to be ambitious and tell you, I could regret this, but I'm going to say it. I'm looking forward to meeting with all of the current regional groups during this year. Now, obviously that's not going to be an in-person meeting. So there'll be in-person ones, there'll be virtual ones. We have already had the January and February ones changed from face-to-face to virtual meetings, but we will meet and we'll be able to talk about these matters. I want to explore new ways in which we can build these local communities to provide either local assistance or links to centrally available advice. I realise that those of you listening this evening are already engaged with the institution, or you may just be curious about what it was I've got to say. Whichever it is, I encourage you to form links with your local group to either share your knowledge and provide support, or to learn from others. I'd also encourage you to try to draw in others who may not realise this huge scope of benefits of our organisation. In terms of local hubs and groups, we will no doubt find that different models evolved to suit different regional groups, different areas, different parts of the world. And the areas of expertise will overlap between these groups. So we need to share that knowledge between the regions of the world. So going forward, I believe that we need to value our past. We need to respect the skills and decisions made in the past and work with them to provide a better built environment for the future. We need to take a pragmatic and practical approach to the reuse of buildings, taking into account the effect on our environment in terms of how much embodied carbon we can save by the reuse of existing structures compared to building new. I'm not trying to say we don't build new at all, but think about reusing before automatically building new. Not only will this look after our heritage, but it will help reduce the enormous carbon footprint of construction. This has to be the future approach for our profession. And as part of this, we need to make sure that this becomes embedded in the core competencies of structural engineers, not sometime in the future, but now. We need to normalise these changed attitudes and use them to engage the unengaged, whether they be colleagues or clients or other members of our design teams. It may start as little steps, but we need to act now. As we become more agile in this way of thinking, these steps will become bigger and more effective. The Climate Emergency Task Group, whose papers in the Structural Engineer, as I've already said, are essential reading, they set us targets of reducing our carbon footprint by 10% each year. We must act now, not just plan to get started sometime soon, next year. It needs to be now. Wherever we work as structural engineers, wherever that is, in the UK, around the world, we're a global organisation, so we really do need to think about this globally. We need to put and keep climate at the top of our priorities. This was done by the institution in a decision made by the board back in 2019, when we decided to put climate emergency on a par with the institution's existing strong focus on structural safety. This is not just for those working in large consultancies, for wealthy clients, it's for all of us. To paraphrase the words of John Wesley, the world is our parish, there are no boundaries. We must all play our part, wherever we are and whoever we work for. Our immediate past president, Don McQuillan, spoke about the 4 C's of competence, communities, collaboration, and communication. Picking up on these, we need to make sure that our engineers, both current and future, are competent to fulfil their role in taking positive climate action. We do not have time for them to all learn over 3 decades like I did. We need to work as a community, both at global and local level, to collaborate and communicate our knowledge and best practice. It will therefore be no surprise that I revert back to saying knowledge, skills, history are our foundation for a climate positive future.
Thank you, Jane. Good evening, everyone. I'm Faith Wainwright and a past president of the institution. It's my privilege to lead you in a vote of thanks for that really terrific address. Thank you. I want to start by saying I'm glad you didn't become a meteorologist, because we wouldn't have you with us tonight. And that was good work by Ian in diverting you to engineering. Jane, you've treated us to a really super address, sharing a lot of your motivation and your interests and how you think. And there's a lot in there to inspire us all. Really enjoyed that. What I saw throughout your address was just a wonderful appreciation of people, people that inspired you, connections between people, sharing knowledge, and the kind of care that I've, the thoughtfulness that I've seen in working with you on the board. I can understand in a new way now, as I kind of seen that deep care and interest in understanding buildings, and clearly it's been a real gift as well as a passion of yours to develop that. I love your idea of the hubs, and would encourage people everywhere that are online and involved to just think how you can create those channels of knowledge sharing that are so vital for us to be able to have an impact. And your skills and advocacy for historic buildings could not be more timely in this year. And I love the way you have so eloquently linked that with the emergency and the urgency of dealing with climate change, and thinking about new ways of doing things with what we have inherited as assets and what we have created as assets. And I think your address really deserves to be read and picked up around our regions and around the world, and really use it as a prompt for very thoughtful debate. And I'm sure as you visit, you will inspire that kind of debate. And we're really grateful that we have you as president with your particular insights there, and particularly with your huge generosity in how you share it and encourage other people to share. Now, I'm going to include a message here from Sarah Buck, who you mentioned, who was the 88th president. And she is online and asked me to deliver this message for you, which I will now do. So Sarah says, "It gives me great pleasure to contribute a few words in tribute to you, Jane, as the 101st president of the Institution of Structural Engineers. Working as a conservation structural engineer, as you do, requires a deep knowledge of structural engineering and a thoroughness of approach. It's all too easy to say, demolish a building. The difficult decisions surround keeping a structure in such a way that you can not only save it, but reuse it and give it a new lease of life. You bring not only a thoroughness of approach, but also a collaborative and inclusive style that enables you to achieve so much. Sarah says, I first got to know you, Jane, in 2006 when you were chair of the Lancashire and Cheshire region, one of the most active and vibrant groups, and you brought energy, enthusiasm to the task. And unsurprisingly, the group had a very successful year. And your contribution for outstanding service to the institution was rightly recognised when you received the Lewis Kent Award. And although I know you are first and foremost an outstanding structural engineer, being the first female president, as Sarah Butt was, I cannot let this moment pass without making reference to the fact that you are third female president. Our institution is a champion of diversity and has made great strides forward since the early 1980s when I was personally addressed as dear gentleman, something I experienced too. There were 10 years between the first and second female presidents, and it's been a mere 3 years between the second and third. So Sarah says, I hope to see this trend continue as the institution gives a lead on recognising the value and importance of female leadership. So I welcome you, Jane, to a long list of distinguished presidents and trust that you'll have a very successful and enjoyable year. So thank you, Sarah, for that message. And Jane, I'm sure you are going to have a wonderful year. Thank you for your really interesting address tonight, all the thought you put into it, the passion, and how you brought all your work to life for us. It was really, really interesting. So please all join me now. Raise your glass at home, clap in the room, and share with thanks for Jane, our president.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that, Faith. It draws me in to really say this concludes the formal part of this evening, and to thank everyone who's joined us online tonight. It's great that so many people have been able to join, and thank you to everyone in the room. And for those in the room, there's some light refreshments. For those online, sorry, you'll have to sort your own out. Good night, everyone. Thank you.